Anyway, talking of expectations, they are definitely up there insofar as the person that is joining me for the next 3 hours, Charlie Rowley, who's a political commentator. Hello, Charlie. Building your part up there.
Yes.
Look, thanks for joining me. Look, the first things first. Let's talk about, shall we, the debates last night. I guess you saw what was, I think, the fourth debate. We've had 2 head-to-heads. We had 2 7-way debates. Your first impressions on last night's proceedings on ITV?
Yes, it was a bit of a non-event for me. Because, as you just said, we've had so many debates before, and it was the same lineup as what we'd heard previously in the week. So
Same people.
Yeah. So the arguments were pretty much rehearsed. There was another clash, obviously. I think what everybody was looking out for between Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt. People like to see.
Well, I think everybody thought at first, when the lineup was first announced for the debate last week, it was going to be a kind of Penny Mordaunt versus Nigel Farage fest, or Nigel Farage versus Angela Rayner. And it's not been, has it? It's been very much kind of pistols drawn between Penny Mordaunt for the Conservatives and Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader of Labour. It's very spat-like, isn't it? It's quite undignified at times, I think. Don't you think? The kind of the arguing between the two of them.
Potentially. I mean, I think, look, I don't think the public sometimes like to see people talking over each other, or they don't like to see those arguments. They like to just hear a very clear plan as to what people are going to do and an explanation, not just sound bites. They want to hear actually the detail of what it is that these politicians are going to do. I think we may be for more rather than others.
I'm not sure we are.
But
no, I know it's all in the manifesto, but obviously now that the 3 of the 4 main parties, if you like, their manifestos are out, they didn't talk about much with regard to policy and indeed ideology last night. There was lots talked about around immigration, the NHS and the economy and so on, but it seemed to be a recycling of the same attack lines. Nigel Farage, of course, had a spring in his step because of the fact that Reform are now 1 point ahead, according to YouGov, just one poll, 1 point ahead of the Conservatives. This was actually predicted. In fact, I remember Nadine Dorries saying last week, give it a couple of days, Reform will be in front of the Conservatives. Nigel Farage then, of course, saying, well, actually now we are the true party of opposition. Now, as a somewhat conservative commentator, Charlie, I don't know how you feel about that, the fact that this upstart new party, who some would actually argue are the real and true Conservatives, have very, very quickly taken the crown and the credibility, if you like, and the voters of the Conservative Party. I mean, do you think Nigel Farage has got a point that they are the new opposition and will be when the Labour Party inevitably become the government, we think, on July the 5th. It does look like it's going to be, albeit maybe on votes rather than seats, Reform that win the second place in terms of the popular vote.
Well, I think that's a very key thing. It's votes rather than seats. And so when it comes to the actual opposition, it will not be Reform. They just the number of seats that they need to form the official opposition. Now, they might be ahead in one poll, as you've said, in terms of the Conservatives. That will be a worry for the Conservatives. And I think part of that worry comes down to just the effective communication that Nigel Farage has been able to deploy in terms when it comes to articulating key areas that the public care about. So whether it's on immigration, whether it's on Brexit, you can't fault Nigel Farage, who has had a long-standing view on these issues and has been able to, I think, captivate a number of people who are still largely, and have been for a long time, largely undecided voters. So yes, we see Labour 20 points ahead in the polls, running away with it, but Theresa May was 20 points ahead in the polls in 2017. She didn't quite run away with it.
But also, interesting, looking at the YouGov poll, it's not just the Conservatives that are giving up votes to Reform. I mean, the Labour Party in this YouGov poll from yesterday are down 3 points, I think. So it's clear that actually Reform seem to be taking votes from both the Conservatives and Labour. I think it's very naive to think that all Labour voters are dyed in the wool insofar as not resonating with the Reform message, particularly when it comes to the Red Wall and Brexit voting Labour constituencies, of which there were many. I think, Labour, I'm sure they are privately, should be quite concerned, I think, about the surge of Reform. It's certainly not just a Reform swapping Conservative vote thing. And of course, yes, as I say, we have 3 weeks left to go. If Farage doesn't make any gaffes, if the idiots on the left literally attack him physically, let's hope not, and obviously that is abhorrent, but if they continue to use such tactics and Starmer continues to be very wooden and Sunak continues to make gaffes, this could end up in a very interesting place indeed, couldn't it, in 3 weeks' time?
Definitely, and you'll have to see how the polls sort of pan out, because you're absolutely right. It is not a given, and people shouldn't fall into what I think is now becoming the narrative that you're only voting reform, or it's only a support that's draining from the Conservatives to reform. It isn't, and you're absolutely right. In those traditional Labour areas, in the Red Wall, people that voted for Brexit, people that voted for the Conservatives for the first time in 2019 because they wanted to level up their community. They left Labour because they thought Labour had left them behind. Now they've seen a bit of a roller coaster of a ride under the Conservatives after the last few years. They probably don't want to necessarily vote for them again, but they don't necessarily also want to go back to a party that they felt had deserted them. So where can they go? And that is why reform, as I say, Nigel being able to articulate the things that matter to those communities, whether it's about Brexit not being completed, if that's their view, whether it's about immigration, where I know lots of people have strongly held views on that. That is where reform have been able to fill that gap.
But he also has a thing that the other politicians don't seem to have, which is a thing called charisma. So Nigel Farage, famously, a very, very good orator, regardless of whether you agree with his policies, his ideology, his approach to things, particularly on immigration, he is a charismatic orator. He's very, very good. And you put him next to the likes of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, maybe lesser Penny Mordaunt. I think Penny Mordaunt's quite a good orator. Angela Rayner, I think, is less credible than she thinks she is. But, those guys have a real uphill struggle, regardless of policy, just because Nigel Farage is far, far more polished. Shall we take a quick look at a bit of a spat last night, the Angela Rayner versus Penny Mordaunt? It's kind of round two, because, of course, in the first debates last week, they were at each other. This is what they were up to last night.
We've got unemployment going up in the latest figures, so we've got to make sure.
Years to come up with some ideas on this, and we have. We've got We've got a workforce plan for the NHS. We've got a workforce plan for social care.
You don't have a workforce plan for social care.
It will inform a vote on the floor of the House of Commons from your democratically elected representatives. We'll be able to cap the visas.
It is absolute rubbish. You've
talk about the issues that the question
and net migration has gone up.
You have no idea. You have no workforce strategy. You have no industrial strategy. You have no
Are you talking to me or Rishi?
Thank you.
Are you talking to me or Rishi? Because that is exactly your opinion.
It's an election campaign.
Like a pub row on a Friday night in Plymouth somewhere or something, isn't it? I mean, again, not very dignified, really. And poor Penny Mordaunt, I mean, she doesn't know who to attack. I mean, her true competition now is reform. But I think she probably thought better than attacking Nigel Farage. And, of course, Nigel Farage doesn't have a record in government to have to defend, where, of course, the Conservatives have been in government for 14 years, as Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer keep reminding us. An interesting attack line, though, from Penny Mordaunt, having a go at Angela Rayner on the basis that she's had 14 years to come up with better policies, better attack lines and so on. I'm not sure the Conservatives should be reminding anybody really of the last 14 years, because it's hard, as we'll talk about in a second, it's hard to reconcile any element of success, isn't it, from the Conservatives' point of view, over the last 3 or 4 years in particular?
Well, I think the last 3 or 4 years have been incredibly difficult, and I think, look,
You sound like a Conservative politician.
Well,
I mean, this is all Sunak says. Well, it has been very, very difficult.
Well,
of course it has. Maybe some would argue the Conservatives are responsible for that.
That's an argument that the public will have to have amongst themselves and decide at the election. But I do think, trying to take sort of the party politics out of it, I think, when you're talking to the electorate in general, you've got to be open, I think, about the challenges. And I don't think enough has been said in this campaign, frankly, about the difficulties of the last few years. Now, yes, you can take a mini budget under a 49-day term Prime Minister, which impacted on people's mortgages and the cost of their bills and all the rest of it. That was a disaster. There's no getting away from that. Even if the sentiment and the ideology might be something that actually lots of Conservatives can agree with. In fact, lots of the country can agree with. But the wrong time, too fast, moving too far, too fast has caused damage. Now, that has to be repaired. That is self-inflicted. But
we are now 2 years on from that.
And the ripple effect has still has lasted, and that is why the Conservatives should be very able to communicate. Now, whether they have been or not is up to the electorate to decide at the election. Whether they've been able to communicate effectively enough to say, look, yes, that was a bit of a problem, but we've turned the corner now. The economy has started to grow, inflation has come down, but also the reason why the debt burden is so high in this country, the reason why they've had, the Conservatives have had to really, take difficult decisions, because it's not inherently Conservative or for reform or anyone want to raise taxes, but they've had to do so because of COVID. Now, again, you can have all kinds of debates about COVID and the regulations and the rules of the lockdowns and all the rest of it.
We spent £500 billion supporting people through COVID. So, do you think Rishi Sunak was wrong in hindsight to do that? Should we have not introduced the furlough scheme? Because that was the thing that seemed to cost the most amount of money.
No, I think it was absolutely right.
Do you think Labour would have done the same thing? Because it was actually quite a socialist thing to do.
Well, I think so. And I think, look, the old Boris attack line, if you remember Boris Johnson, I'm sure your listeners do.
Vaguely rings a bell.
Some politician somewhere.
Yeah.
He was very, very clear at making the argument. Again, another good orator. And, for what it's worth, if there's any Conservative listening at Central Office, I would try and get him back on the campaign somehow, somewhere.
Or maybe some have argued he should have been chairman of the party. I have to say in that regard, Richard Holden, of course, he's the Conservative Party chairman, and yes, he's had rather a torrid time over the last few weeks, having parachuted himself into the very safe seat of Billericay and Basildon amidst much controversy. So yes, maybe it should have been Boris, but I guess you don't have to be a member of Parliament to be the chairman of the Conservative Party, do you? The other things that I think were interesting last night in the debate were the attack lines from Penny Mordaunt on Labour with regard to the tax holes, the gaps in the Labour manifesto with regard to a seeming gap of 37 billion, it said, whereby Labour have that gap to fill in terms of uncosted policies. But in particular, the number that kept coming out was that the Labour Party will be responsible for effectively a greater tax burden on Britain. And actually that hasn't particularly been defended. If it has, the likes of Angela Rayner, also Lisa Nandy doing the rounds yesterday, they haven't defended that very well insofar as saying, no, that's wrong. We will not have to raise taxes to the tune of £7 billion to pay for our manifesto. But it seems, if let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say they're being rather ambiguous about it, but it does seem, according to a lot of academic analysis, that the Labour manifesto will result in the tax burden being higher and therefore people having to pay more taxes to pay for such things. The Labour Party, of course, will say, yeah, no, we've got it all costed in terms of how we're going to raid non-DOMs. Well, that's largely been done already by the Conservatives, funnily enough. There's not a fag paper between them, is there? And, of course, the VAT on school fees, which you have to question the calculations on the basis that, presumably, that allows for no students coming out of private education and into the state system, which therefore will mean, if they do, a loss of VAT to the Exchequer, but also a cost to the state in terms of those children going into the state school sector. So does it appear to you that there is a gap and that Labour are being rather disingenuous and ambiguous, shall we say, in terms of providing the rationale behind the fact that taxes are going to have to go up under Labour? I mean, I think that's the line, isn't it?
Absolutely. And look, if there was an effective campaign operation in place, this would have been all over every front page newspaper, every broadcast, that you would have had every Treasury Minister, I think, out chomping at the bit to go on the morning media round to say this is, a tax on working people. This is Labour not being genuine and open, honest. Exactly. And, because Labour for so long have been able to trail the fact that their manifesto will be fully costed, fully funded. We're not going to raise income tax, national insurance or VAT. Nothing to see here.
Some of this, Charlie, might be a matter of interpretation, might it?
Exactly. But that narrative has been able to set in the public's mind. So when it comes to countering that, and if you don't have an effective counter operation to that, then you allow people just to think, well, hang on, actually, I'm not quite sure about the facts and figures because actually the Tory manifesto, the tax burden slightly went up as well. So
clear honesty would be a nice thing from politicians, but don't hold your breath, everybody.